Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through this fall-themed bridal shower set. This one was super near and dear to my heart, and I can't wait to tell you about all the different designs. So first up, we have one of my absolute favorite plaque cutters ever. This is the Nancy plaque by Kaleidacuts. It's just so simple, but so perfect. It has just the right amount of character, and the curves on the edge of this design are just so easy and natural to do with royal icing. Big fan. I think I have this cutter in every color and highly recommend it. So what I'm doing here for this set, I used a 2 consistency outline and flood. I did make this set a couple years ago. Back then, I was just more comfortable with 2 consistency. Today, I prefer 1, but as you've heard me say many times before, there's no right or wrong to 1 or 2. It's just what you're more comfortable with. And when I do use 2, usually I do allow the outline to dry. That's when it functions the best, because it's really that kind of fence holding up the flood icing on the inside. Sometimes I will leave the outline wet, and that's for very specific applications. I let the icing dry, and now I am using one of my favorite techniques. This is how I like to do wood grain. I don't have an airbrush, so I obviously don't do that. I mean, you can do it with icing. I've seen some really cool ways, but this is my favorite one. It is the easiest. I'm using Americolor Chocolate Brown Gel Food Coloring straight out of the bottle. I do not dilute it. And I just put the tiniest bit on the end of this fan brush. That's it. So simple. I allow that to dry mostly, and here I'm using some edible paint to paint on here. You can use edible paint. You can use, the gold here is the edible paint. You can use other luster dusts that you mix with Everclear. Either one works. I think in this case I just wasn't doing a lot of gold, and so I kind of wanted to be lazy and use the edible paint. Now, something I didn't film here, but it's important to mention, is that when you use pure gel food coloring like this, it's going to dry, but it's going to be kind of sticky. And a way to get rid of that sticky is, first of all, make sure you're not putting too much on in the first place. But then once it's more or less dried, brush it with cornstarch, and that will get rid of that tackiness. It will make it a little more of a matte finish, so just keep that in mind, but it beats having that tackiness and getting that all over the bags once you bag them. Here I am using the Peony Blooms font, and I'm projecting this using my projector, my handy projector. This was my Pico. This was the first projector I had. I have another projector now that I call my Bluetooth. I have both of them linked in the description. The Pico was just great for the first year, I think, but you have to make sure you plug it in correctly. It will mess with the projector, and you'll think it just stops working one day because you haven't been plugging in correctly. I had to learn that the hard way. I'm doing the pressure piped lettering here, so I'm applying more pressure on the downstroke and releasing most of my pressure on the upstroke. I'm using actually somewhere here between a soft and a medium peak. If you're going to do anything, go on either end of the soft peak. Definitely go stiffer than thinner for lettering. And when I finished this, I thought it just needed a little extra something to tie it into the set a little bit better. So I took this teal color that comes from a couple of other cookies in the set, and I'm putting this outline here. When I do an outline like this on a surface that's already been flooded, I try to hug the edge of the shape of the cookie, not place the outline on top, but actually hug it. And I feel like that gives you the best bird's eye view of the cookie. You don't see any of the like flood base peeking through on the outside of the outline, if that makes sense. So that is the first cookie in this set. Up next, we have one of my favorites. This is a generic, I don't know if this is a leaf or what, and I'm pretty sure that I got this at some random cheap metal cookie cutter store, so I don't have it linked, unfortunately. But I've used it for leaves before, and for this one, I just wanted like a basic kind of blank canvas that I could put this wheat on top of. And I love this because it gave me just a little like character and shape to it. So it was perfect. And I'm doing this 2 consistency outline and flood again, as I did with the other cookie, and I will do with all of them in this set. This, I would say, is somewhere between my thick and my thin flood. It's not quite a thin flood, and the reason I know that is because it needs some help settling, and I'm going to help it. There we go. This is one benefit to decorating on top of a paper towel. It makes doing this very easy. You don't have to worry about ruining your cookie by trying to pick it up. So allow that surface to at least crust significantly. And now I am using a medium peak piping consistency to pipe this wheat detail. And I do have this on a cookie swivel, which if you've watched my videos, you will know that I rarely ever use a cookie swivel. I only use it when absolutely necessary for 2 reasons. Number one, first of all, just for filming purposes. I think that it is more visually satisfying to watch something that doesn't have this cookie swivel constantly moving. And then secondly, I think it's a crutch. It can be a crutch that prohibits you from really growing as a cookie decorator because it allows you to constantly move the cookie always. I see some people who flood a cookie while turning the cookie swivel, and I think it's important to learn to do as much as you can without a cookie swivel. That's just my personal opinion. So let me talk about the wheat that I'm doing right here. This is a pressure piped teardrop. So I'm piping a dot, and then as I'm pulling away from the dot, I'm releasing the pressure. This is the same kind of motion that I do for scales on a fish or a mermaid. You do need to use more like a medium peak for this so that it really holds its shape. I find with a soft peak, it tends to kind of lose the definition a bit too much. And I liked that you could kind of see a very thinned out pull on the end of each wheat section. I feel like I should know what that word is. Not a cookie word, actual real life word. But anywho, some people might prefer that it kind of has a cleaner end to it, but I thought it looked a bit more realistic and more wheaty this way. And then I just wanted to finish it off with a little bit of string, I guess this would be, something holding the wheat bunch together. Et voila, there is the wheat cookie. Up next, oh man, this was a labor of love, pun intended I suppose, since it is a heart. This is the Funky Scalloped Heart by Kaleidacuts. And I'm starting here by doing brush embroidery, which is such a throwback for me. When I first started, that was my go-to technique. It's, to me, I feel like it was born from Sweet Am's. It's one of her classic techniques. It's one of the first techniques I learned how to do, but it's funny, I don't do it as much anymore. So what I'm doing is I prefer to use a soft peak piping consistency if I can, but if you only have medium peak, that's fine. And I like to do a pretty thick pipe on the edge. And I'm taking this brush. You can use different brushes, like you could use a thicker brush. It just gives you a different look. But I'm using this angled brush that I dampen. I want it damp, not wet. Damp, not wet. And I just find that that makes it easier to pull the icing down. You don't want to go all the way to the edge of the line, as you see I do sometimes. Do as I say, not as I do. The reason for that is because you still want to maintain that outer edge of the line that you've piped. This is where if I had piped this a bit thicker, that might have helped, so I don't feel like I have to pull so much of the line down. It's also important to not pipe too much at a time because you can't do this technique once the icing has crusted. Keep that in mind. That's why I only piped half of the heart first and then the other half. Next up, actually, okay, so I lied, I'm sorry. This is one shape that I did a one consistency outline and flood, and that's because I do not believe I needed red. You know what, I'm correcting myself. there is later when I use a stiff peak red. But anywho, this was totally fine to do in a one consistency outline in flood. And oh, I just love this red. You've heard me say this a million times. For red, hands down, the Sugar Art Master Elite Red. It's a highly pigmented powder. You don't need as much of it. It is my go-to. I do not use red for anything else. Okay, but let's talk about the real star of the show here. So it's a debate whether this is cross stitch or, I mean, my inspiration here was lace for this. So I'm not sure which one it is exactly, but it's pretty whatever it is. So I'm actually using flood consistency here for these lines in a really, really, really small tip. And the reason that I did that was because I knew I was going to be traveling with these cookies, and I find personally when you use certainly a medium peak and even a soft peak, when you're doing these overlapped lines, they don't always kind of melt together at the intersections, if that makes sense. Like they lay on top of each other. And so if you were to press down on the intersections of the lines, they would crumble, right, once they dry. And I was just really paranoid that that was going to happen. But I knew if I used a flood consistency, they would definitely melt into each other at all of the intersections. And so I cut a tiny, tiny tip. Now, I certainly made this even harder on myself, and that's why I'm working pretty quickly, because if you're going to flood tiny lines like this if you're going to pipe tiny lines like this with a flood consistency, it comes out of the bag pretty quickly. And you can see not all the starts of my lines are that great, but I just rolled with it. It was fine. So people ask me all the time, how do you pipe such straight lines? It just comes naturally, unfortunately, but I think some of the tips I can give you, first of all, make sure you're bracing your arm on the table, whether it be your elbow on the table or just above your elbow on the edge of the table. You can see this is the one line that broke. And considering how many lines I piped, I was pretty darn proud that I just broke one line. Lines break because of inconsistent pressure on your bag as you're piping. What else do I do? So you do need to make sure you're lifting your bag up off the surface of the cookie, depending on how fast the icing is coming up and the distance you need to go. It can be anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to even like an inch off the surface of the cookie. It's a lot. That's what's going to get you the straightest lines. And to always keep your eyes ahead of your piping, so you're guiding your line. It's just like if you read music, your eyes are always going to be ahead of the moment that you're in. So hopefully those tips help. You can see here that the lines have really melted into each other. If you're really uncomfortable freehanding this too, you could use an edible marker and sketch this out first. Now just bear in mind that if you're doing them as close as I did and your edible marker is really thick, then your piped lines might not cover your marker. So just keep that in mind. I let the lines dry, and now I'm piping in the cross stitch or the lacy bit, whatever this is exactly. It looks like I'm actually using a flood consistency, which I'm kind of amazed at. I'm amazed because that kind of thing, very small like that, could very well crater, and amazingly, I don't think any of them cratered. But I just didn't want to deal with little peaks at the tip of each of my dots. It's possible this is a really thin soft peak. That's what I'd probably recommend doing. Something that's still a piping consistency to make sure it doesn't crater, but something that's thin enough that's going to settle with a smooth dome to it instead of a little peak, because I feel like that would kind of just ruin the look. It has a little peak to it. I planned this out ahead of time, the pattern that I wanted to do. And I wanted to make sure that I got enough hearts in there. That's why I did the lines so close. This was, I believed, the smallest pattern that I could do with the heart. And that's why, and I wanted there to be, like I said, enough in here for it to be visually appealing. Et voila! That, I wanted this to be like rustic, lacy inspired, and so that's where that came from. This cutter this is another Kaleidacuts classic. This is the Miss to Misses, the one and only time so far that I have used this cutter. Big fan of it. I like her hand lettered cookies especially. They're just really simple. It's a great way, it's kind of an easy way to do hand lettering or like lettering on cookies because the shape of the cookie is designed for the lettering. And I feel like it just makes the composition that much better. Here I am, I'm using my edible paint again. And I'll link that in the description as well as some other gold dust options. And here we go. So something to just keep in mind about intellectual property when it comes to lettering. So this lettering was done by Kaleidacuts, and I have the right to use it because I purchased the cutter. I know she's been doing some more digital files lately, so if you don't want to buy the cutter but you want to use her lettering, you can purchase that file so that you can rightfully use her lettering. And I just think she does like really, I just love her designs. You know, it's harder when you're doing lettering on a basic plaque because then you really have to do more to make it look like a composition, whereas this is already a composition, it's already a design because the shape of the cookie is based off of the lettering. And something else, so if I had more patience, which you know I have just enough but not too much patience, I could go in with a scribe and settle out the downstrokes just to make them look even more fabulous. I always admire the cookiers who do that because it's just, I mean, it really does add that extra bit of just like perfection to it, but I just don't have that much patience, so I don't do that. This cutter here is, I believe it's the Geometric Leaf or Maple Leaf by Brighton Cutters. Just a really simple maple leaf. This was a barn wedding in the fall, so naturally I was doing up, barn wedding in the fall in the Northeast, so had to play up the maple leaves in this case. And this actually inspired, I did the place cards for this wedding as well. This was one of my dear childhood friends, and this design, which I made before the wedding because this was for the bridal shower, inspired what I made for the wedding. And yeah, my icing here was, it did not need to be this thick. Like, this is more like a thick flood almost with a piped outline. And it's like, Grace, the whole point of doing a 2 consistency outline and flood is that you can use a thinner flood and you don't have to do all of this tweaking with a scribe to make it dry. So here, this is another Pure Gel food coloring. I believe this is Egg Yellow Americolor. Doing a little splatter of that edible gold paint. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. And then this is the cornstarch trick that I mentioned earlier. I actually filmed this one. Just very lightly brush it on. It can be a little scary because you feel like you're going to like brush off the paint on it. But as long as you have actually let it dry, you know, I don't know, 5-6 hours maybe. That's maybe even overnight. That's when I do the cornstarch. And here I was feeling bold / lazy and I actually freehanded all of the numbers. They're not perfect, but they're good enough. And that's the vibe I was feeling. Good enough. I love it. Has a nice energy coming from the bottom left corner. So here we go. Here's another design. This is the mason jar. Goes with the like rustic barny wedding action. That's the teal that I gave you a taste of in that first cutter. Classic shape. My cookie cutter was from Sweet Sugar Belle, but just about every cutter maker has their own mason jar these days. I like this one because it's a little fatter. I think some of the other designs are a bit slimmer, but really either will work. And again, you can tell this is a thick flood because it's not settling on its own. It needs a little jiggle help. And then piping some detail here. So this is that pressure piped motion, the same one that I did on the wheat cookie. Piping that dot, pulling away, and releasing the pressure. That's a medium peak. And the next consistency is going to just be these little rosettes with the very small Wilton star tip. And this is going to be somewhere between a medium and a stiff peak. Probably should have been closer to a stiff peak because that's what's going to really maintain that shape. Florals are not my strong suit. I will admit that. And I'm okay with that. I am okay with that. Okay, here's the peony blooms again. And I was going for the ball jar look where there's raised lettering on it. So I'm actually using the same color as the base, which is a little technique trick that I don't often do. So because of the shadows of the light, you still get just enough definition of the lettering to be able to see it. I know some people might be like, you can't see the lettering if it's the same color as the base. It's a whole look. I'm a big fan of it. I use it in certain situations, circumstances. Using that same, I would say this is between a medium and a stiff peak. Just to give a little more definition to, more character to this ball jar, mason jar. And then I thought it was missing something after I let it dry, so I added a little heart in the middle. And that finishes that one. And then last, but certainly not least, is this ring. And I'm gonna admit here that this was a doozy. This is my least favorite cookie of the entire set. I'm absolutely overly critical of myself. This was a hard cookie to make. The people who do this cookie make it look so easy. So as you saw, the first thing that I did was I just happened to have a circle cutter that was just the right size. I have a very basic circle cutter set with a whole bunch of different sizes. And I just pressed that into the cookie so that I could get a circle. You could also just trace that with an edible marker. And I think what's so hard about this is that if you don't get the circle just right and the thickness of the ring part just right, it just looks wonky. Anywho, so the squiggles I'm doing right here is with that piping consistency to help prevent craters. It just gives a little extra stability in the middle of the icing. And it's especially good for small spaces. It doesn't always work, so you see me do it sometimes and not always. I prefer these days to just use a thicker consistency. Like if I did this today, I would use a soft peak to pressure flood this area instead of doing that squiggle. It's also much harder to flood on top of these squiggles, which maybe is also why I didn't get the cleanest flood that I wanted. But you live, you learn. Everyone's still learning. Everyone still has things to learn, myself included. And yeah, I mean, YOLO. It was good enough. You can just see like the top of my circle wasn't quite round. But you know what? Whatever. And even though, see, even though I did the squiggles, like, it still wasn't very poofy, and that's because the flood that I was using was just, it was just too thin. I shouldn't have used that for this, but here we go. So this is the one application of the edible paint that I was not thrilled with. As you can see, even though I flooded this, even though the base color here is a yellow, which should help support the gold, if I had done this in white, it would not be as good coverage. But I found that it wasn't opaque enough with one coat. So I had to go through and do a second coat, which is not the end of the world. Like, so you can see it's kind of splotchy, but it just, you know, first of all, you have to use more product and it takes more time. So it's just kind of frustrating. The one nice thing about this design though, is that you can be kind of messy while you're painting, because you're going to be filling in the center of that circle and the diamond area of the ring. So you don't have to be as careful with painting as nice, because then it takes a little less time. It's always an added bonus. And then I'm gonna let that dry after I stop messing with it. Give that a moment to dry. Looks like I didn't film that little outline first. But here we go with the diamond portion. Just giving this a flood. And I believe I'm going to put a hearty dose of glitter on this. Now, this is not the glitter I used today. That's all I'm gonna say. Today I would use the Sugar Art Diamond Dust in white. 1000%. That's what I would be using. Sorry, I just got lost in my own flood. Okay, focus, Grace. What else can I say at this point? I'm just looking at, oh, see, look at the circle. I'm just picking myself apart. Oy vey. Okay, now I'm gonna do some piping. The rest of this is just basically to distract from what I deem to be not the most perfect piping or like flooding skills. I mean, this is to add the definition of the diamond. Gorgeous. Simple but effective. I wasn't originally going to outline it like this. For some reason, I felt that this would distract more from the uneven circle. I don't know, maybe? I don't know. I don't know if it ultimately helped. Undecided. Maybe it makes it look more intentional. Okay, so this is the real moment where I try to cover as much of that circle as possible. So pulling in the same kind of little rosettes that I did on the mason jar, doing that here with the same colors, making them as big as as big as I possibly can. And then I'm going to pull in that other little pressure piped kind of chain motif. This was the moment where I was like, oh, Grace, you really should have done that first and then piped the flowers. That would have been a better order of business. But like I said, you live, you learn. That icing I could tell had thinned by this point, and that was like a thin, soft peak. Felt like it needed a little something more. So this is the same type of tip, and I'm just doing these tiny little rosettes to fill it in. And there we go. That is the ring. And friends, we have reached the end of this set. Oh, this brings back such good memories. I went to the bridal shower. I went to the wedding. I love doing cookies for people that I love. And I hope you enjoyed watching this. And I hope you try one or more of these designs yourself. So have a sweet one.